"You're not needed here. Get out of my bay." The words came from Dr. Preston Wall's mouth, the way all his words did, clipped and final, like a door slamming shut on any possibility of discussion, and Dorothy Reeves stood at the foot of the gurney and did not move for exactly 3 seconds, because she had learned a long time ago that reacting too fast was how you lost the room. The man on the gurney was named Raymond Osei, 62 years old, a retired postal worker who had driven himself to Millhaven General at 9:40 on a Tuesday night, because something in his chest felt wrong in a way that was different from indigestion, and different from anxiety, and different from anything he had felt before, and Dorothy had known from the moment she touched his wrist that he was right to be afraid. The ER was loud the way it always was at that hour. The particular chaos of a Tuesday night in a mid-sized city where the weekend emergencies had tapered off, but the chronic ones never did, where the overhead lights buzzed at a frequency that made new nurses wince and old ones didn't notice anymore, where the smell of antiseptic and coffee and something underneath both of those things that never quite went away had soaked into the walls over the decades until it was just what air smelled like. Dorothy moved through it like she always had, which was to say quietly and with complete certainty about where she was going at all times. She was 58 years old with silver hair cut close to her head because long shifts didn't leave time for anything else, and she had the kind of face that didn't announce itself. The kind that people looked past in hallways and waiting rooms and board meetings. The kind that had learned early on that being overlooked was not the same as being powerless, and she had spent 28 years at Millhaven General turning that particular lesson into something close to an art form. She wore the same blue scrubs as everyone else on the floor, kept her stethoscope in her left pocket, and pinned to the right lapel of her scrub top was a small silver pin, no bigger than a thumbnail in the shape of an oak tree with its roots and branches visible in equal measure. The kind of detail that people noticed once and then forgot because it didn't fit any obvious category, and humans are remarkably good at dismissing things they can't immediately categorize. Nobody ever asked about the pin. Dorothy never explained it. She had been with Raymond Osei for 11 minutes when Wall walked into Bay 3, and in those 11 minutes she had taken his blood pressure twice, felt his pulse at 3 different points, watched the rhythm on his monitor with the careful attention of someone reading a language she had been fluent in for decades, and reached a conclusion that was as clear to her as her own name. Preston Wall was 51, with hair the color of old wheat combed back in a way that probably took longer than he would admit, and he moved through the ER with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never in his professional memory been seriously wrong about anything, or at least had never been made to feel the weight of it when he was. He was the chief of emergency medicine at Millhaven General, which meant that his word in this building was essentially the final one, and he wore that authority the way some men wore expensive watches, not because they needed to know the time, but because they wanted you to know they could afford it. When he told Dorothy she wasn't needed, and to get out of his bay, he had not yet looked at the monitor. He had not yet touched Raymond Osei. He had walked in, assessed the scene in a single glance. Older black man, anxious expression, slightly elevated posture, and made his determination before a single piece of clinical data had entered his decision-making process. Dorothy took her 3 seconds. Then she said in a voice pitched low enough that only Wall and the nearest nurse could hear, "His rhythm is irregular, and his pressure has dropped 8 points in the last 6 minutes. I'd recommend we discuss a CT angiogram before I said you're not needed." Wall moved to the monitor, glanced at it the way you glance at a clock when you already know what time it is, and turned back to her. "Thank you for your assessment." The words "thank you for your assessment" in that tone of voice meant the exact opposite of what they said, and everyone within 20 feet understood that, and not one of them said anything. Dorothy looked at Raymond Osei. He was watching her with eyes that knew the way sick people always know when someone in the room is the one person actually paying attention to them, and she gave him a small, steady nod that was meant to say, "I see you." And then she stepped back from the gurney because she had also learned over 28 years exactly when fighting a battle in the moment would cost her the ability to fight a larger one later. She walked back to the nurse's station. Behind her, she heard Wall tell Raymond Osei that what he was experiencing was most likely anxiety-related, that his heart was strong, that they'd run an EKG to be thorough, and that he should try to breathe slowly. Dorothy picked up a different chart and began writing notes in handwriting that was precise and legible and would hold up under scrutiny the handwriting of someone who had always known that her words might need to be read by people who weren't in the room when she said them. Dr. Finn Cassidy was 30 years old and had been at Millhaven General for 14 months, which was long enough to have absorbed the atmosphere of the place, but not long enough to have developed the instincts that only come from years of sitting with patients and learning to read what they can't articulate. And when Dorothy found him near the supply room 20 minutes after Wall had dismissed her from Bay 3, she could see in his posture the particular exhaustion of a young doctor who was trying very hard to appear like he wasn't overwhelmed. "Dr. Cassidy," she said, keeping her voice neutral in the way she had mastered over decades. "I need you to take another look at Mr. Osei in Bay 3. I know Dr. Wall has already assessed him, but his presentation is concerning me, and I want to put my concern on record with you directly." Cassidy looked up from his clipboard with the expression of someone who wanted to be helpful and was simultaneously dreading the implication of what being helpful might require. "Dr. Wall said he's anxious. His pulse is irregular in a way that isn't consistent with anxiety," Dorothy said, "and his blood pressure has been dropping incrementally since he arrived. Those two things together in a 62-year-old man who describes shortness of breath and chest heaviness that came on without physical exertion are textbook indicators for a pulmonary embolism. I'd like to recommend a CT angiogram." Cassidy glanced down the hallway toward where Wall had disappeared. The gesture was small and involuntary and said everything about the architecture of power in that building. "I hear you," Cassidy said, which Dorothy had learned over the years was what people said when they intended to do nothing but wanted you to feel acknowledged. "But if Dr. Wall has already assessed—" "Dr. Cassidy." She said his name a second time, not louder, just more precisely the way you say a word when you need someone to actually hear it rather than simply receive the sound. "I am documenting this conversation. I am documenting that I raised this concern to you at 9:57 p.m. and that I recommended further imaging. Whatever decision you make after this point is your decision to make. But I want us both to be clear that the concern was raised." Something moved across Cassidy's face. Not quite guilt, not quite recognition. Something between the two that hadn't quite found its name yet, and then he straightened his clipboard and said, "I'll flag it for Dr. Wall." Dorothy said, "Thank you," and walked back toward Bay 3 because she was going to keep her eyes on Raymond Osei regardless of what anyone told her, and that was simply a fact about how she operated that nobody at this hospital had ever managed to change. She stood at the edge of the bay where she could see the monitor without being in Wall's direct sightline. Raymond's wife Ruth had arrived by now, a small woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a cloth purse clutched in both hands, the way people hold things when they're scared, and there's nothing else to hold on to. Ruth sat in the chair beside the gurney and was asking Raymond questions in a low voice, and Raymond was answering them slowly, and Dorothy watched the rhythm on his monitor the way a person watches a door they believe is about to open. Behind her at the far end of the bay corridor, she heard the particular sound of Preston Wall's footsteps, that deliberate unhurried strike of heel on tile that announced him the way a drumbeat announces something arriving, and then she heard him stop, and she turned slightly to see him watching her. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her standing there watching his patient, and his jaw moved in a small, tight way that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite something else. Then he walked away. Dorothy turned back to the monitor. She reached into her pocket and touched the small silver pin she had transferred there from her lapel earlier. A habit the same way some people touch a watch or a ring when they need to remind themselves of something important. And then she pulled her hand out and picked up the chart again and kept writing. On the way home, she had told herself once years ago was when you processed things. When you were here, you were here. You were not thinking about what you felt, you were watching the rhythm on the monitor and writing notes in handwriting that would hold up under scrutiny and waiting for the thing you already knew was coming. She didn't have to wait long. 47 minutes after Wall had told her she wasn't needed, the monitor in Bay 3 started to scream. The sound of a crashing monitor at 11 at night carries differently than it does at noon. There's a particular quality to emergency sounds in the late hours when the building is quieter and the staff is thinner and the sound has more space to travel. And everyone in the ER heard it at the same time and felt the same drop in their stomach that they had all felt the first 100 times and never entirely got used to. Dorothy was already moving before the alarm fully registered because she had been watching and she had known, and she reached Bay 3 with the crash cart 30 seconds before anyone else did, which was 30 seconds of Raymond Osei's life that would matter. He had gone down in his chair, not collapsed dramatically the way people collapse in movies, but folded the way a person folds when the effort of staying upright simply becomes too much. And Ruth had caught him by the arm and was calling his name in a voice that was doing everything it could to stay calm and not quite managing it. And Dorothy was already beside him, 2 fingers at his neck, reading his pulse the way she read everything quickly, completely, without requiring anyone's permission to act. "He's in cardiac arrest," she said, clearly to no one and to everyone. And she began CPR with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this enough times that the physical memory lived in her hands independently of her conscious mind. The team arrived in pieces the way teams always did, a resident first, then 2 nurses, then a second resident, and finally Preston Wall, who came through the bay entrance at a pace that communicated authority and confidence, even now, even at this moment, and who took one look at Dorothy doing compressions over his patient and said, "I'll take over," and moved to position himself beside the gurney. Dorothy stepped back without argument because she had learned which battles to fight in the moment and which ones to document for later, and because the most important thing right now was Raymond Osei's heart, not her proximity to it. She watched Wall work. She watched his technique, his rhythm, the way his hands positioned themselves, and she watched the monitor, and she watched the faces of the nurses who were moving around the bay with controlled urgency, and she watched Ruth Osei pressed against the far wall with her cloth purse still clutched in both hands, and her lips moving in something that might have been prayer. They got him back. It took 8 minutes and 2 rounds of epinephrine and 1 defibrillation, and the kind of focused adrenaline-driven team effort that the ER was capable of producing when it had to, and Raymond Osei's heart found its rhythm again, unsteady at first, then settling into something that the monitors agreed was survivable. He was intubated, sedated, and wheeled toward the ICU within 15 minutes, and a cardiologist was finally belatedly on his way from the on-call suite, arriving now for a conversation that should have happened before Raymond Osei's heart had to be restarted. Dorothy watched the gurney disappear around the corner. Then she went back to the nurse's station and picked up her chart and kept writing. Ruth Osei stood near the doorway of the now empty bay, not moving one hand flat on the wall, as if she needed it for balance. Dorothy walked over and stood beside her. Not touching, not speaking, just present in the specific way that 28 years had taught her, was sometimes the only thing you could actually offer a person, and that it was never nothing. Wall walked past them without stopping. He glanced at Dorothy once briefly, the same tight jaw movement as before. Dorothy did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Ruth Osei, who was staring at the empty gurney with the expression of a woman recalculating every assumption she had made about the world in the last 2 hours. Outside the bay windows, the corridor hummed with its ordinary late-night business, and nobody said anything about the 47 minutes, or the question that hadn't been asked, or the imaging that hadn't been done, and the silence around all of that was as loud as anything Dorothy had heard all evening. The note was in her locker when she came in the next morning, handwritten on hospital letterhead in the firm slanted script that she recognized without needing to see the signature at the bottom. "See me. 8 a.m. Wall." She folded it, put it in her pocket, and went to check on her patients first because she had never in 28 years walked into a meeting before she was ready, and being ready meant knowing what had happened to the people she cared for. And Raymond Osei was in the ICU now with a cardiologist, finally belatedly criminally on his case, and his monitor showed a rhythm that was at least surviving if not yet stable. She stood at the window of his ICU room for 2 minutes. Then she went to see Wall. The office was on the second floor, a corner room with windows that looked onto the parking structure and a desk that was too large for the space. And when Dorothy walked in at 2 minutes past 8, she found that she was not the only one who had been invited to this meeting. Nadine Cross sat in the chair beside the window, the director of risk management, a woman in her early 50s with hair, the pale, almost white blonde of someone who had been maintaining the same dye job for 20 years, always in a navy blazer, always with a folder thick enough to suggest that whatever she had to say had been prepared in advance and would be delivered with the professional detachment of someone who had long ago separated the concept of right from the concept of liability. Wall was behind his desk. He did not gesture for Dorothy to sit. She stood. "You created a serious problem last night," Wall said, beginning in the middle the way he always did, because in his mind the context was always already established. "When I told you Mr. Osei's assessment was complete, you continued to hover. You made comments to Dr. Cassidy that were outside your scope, and you undermined the clinical decision-making process of the attending physician in front of his staff," Mr. Osei coded, Dorothy said, "after which our team performed an excellent resuscitation. After 47 minutes of a pulmonary embolism going undiagnosed because I wasn't listened to." Wall's right hand came down on the desk. Not a slam, just a firm placement, the way he settled his fingers before he made a point he considered final. "You are not a cardiologist. You are not a physician. You are a nurse. And in this hospital, nurses operate within their defined scope of practice, and that scope does not include overruling attending physicians on diagnostic decisions." Dorothy looked at him steadily. "My scope includes documenting patient safety concerns. I documented them. I raised them verbally to Dr. Cassidy at 9:57 p.m. I raised them to you directly. Both times I was dismissed. Both times you were appropriately redirected by the responsible physician," Nadine Cross said, opening her folder with the smooth motion of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, "and both times you continued to act outside that redirection." She looked down at the pages as if consulting them, though her tone suggested she had memorized every word. "This is the third time in 18 months that you've escalated a patient concern past the attending physician and created a disruption in the clinical workflow. The first instance 14 months ago, the FAM case. The second, 8 months ago, the Garmin case. Now this. In the FAM case, Dorothy said the patient received the wrong medication dosage and sustained nerve damage. In the Garmin case, the patient died. In this case, the patient coded and is currently in the ICU. Those are clinical outcomes that were thoroughly reviewed," Nadine said. "They were reviewed and closed without investigation. They were reviewed and determined to represent appropriate clinical judgment under the circumstances." The room was quiet for a moment. Wall's fingers settled on the desk again. The unhurried tap that Dorothy had observed was his way of punctuating decisions that had already been made before he arrived. "We're letting you go," he said, "effective immediately. 2 weeks severance and a neutral reference. Your badge and access will be deactivated by end of day." Dorothy looked at him, then at Nadine, then back at Wall. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She had known on some level that lived below conscious thought that this meeting was always going to end this way, had known it perhaps not today specifically, but eventually, inevitably, as a destination that the road she was on had been leading toward for a long time. She said in a voice that was quiet and clear and held nothing that could be interpreted as a threat, though it was the most precise statement she had made all morning. "You don't understand what's coming." Wall's lip curled slightly. "Is that a threat?" "No," Dorothy said. "It's a fact. I've been doing this a long time. Long enough to know that the things people bury don't stay buried. They just get harder to dig up." She turned and walked out before either of them could respond, and behind her she heard nothing. No words, no objection, no sound at all, and the silence told her everything she needed to know about whether they believed her. Before she reached the door, she paused for exactly 1 second and looked back at the nameplate on Wall's desk. Dr. Preston J. Wall, Chief of Emergency Medicine, and she read it the way you read something you intend to remember precisely. Then she walked out. The security guard assigned to escort her out was a man named Davis, 43 years old, built wide across the shoulders, with a face that was habitually stern on duty and completely different when he was off it. And he had shared coffee with Dorothy in the break room on what she calculated was somewhere between 80 and 100 separate occasions over the past several years, and he had always called her Miss Dot, and she had always called him Davis. And when he appeared at her office door with his lanyard and his badge and the uncomfortable expression of a man who had been given an assignment that he found professionally necessary and personally painful, she saved him the difficulty of saying anything by simply picking up her bag and walking toward the door before he could speak. "You don't have to say anything," she told him not unkindly. "Miss Dot." "I know, Davis. You're doing your job. Let's go." She walked through the ER the way she had walked through it for 28 years with purpose without hurry, eyes forward. And she noted with the peripheral awareness of someone who had spent decades reading rooms that the staff responded to her passage in 3 distinct ways. Some of them met her eyes with the careful sympathy of people who knew exactly what had happened and could do nothing about it. Some of them found sudden, urgent business in the opposite direction. And a few of the residents, the ones who had been there long enough to absorb the particular culture that Wall had cultivated over time, simply looked through her, which was its own kind of statement. Tara Bloom was standing near the medication cart when Dorothy came through, clipboard in hand, and she was the only person in the corridor who didn't move, didn't look away, didn't pretend to be occupied, just stood there with her clipboard held against her chest, like it was something she needed for protection, and her eyes were red in a way that she was clearly hoping wasn't obvious. And she looked at Dorothy with an expression that Dorothy recognized as the particular anguish of a young person watching something unjust happen in real time and not yet knowing what to do with that knowledge. Dorothy gave her a small, steady nod, the same nod she had given Raymond Osei the night before, the one that meant "I see you," and kept walking. They had reached the corridor that led to the automatic exit doors when the monitor in Bay 4 started screaming. Dorothy stopped. Davis stopped beside her. Through the glass of Bay 4, she could see a young woman, maybe 22, slight, with dark hair fanned across the pillow, whose body was arching and seizing in the distinctive, terrible rhythm of status epilepticus, which was a condition in which the brain's electrical storm refused to stop, and which would kill her with a calm and absolute certainty if nobody stopped it in the next 90 seconds to 2 minutes. Dr. Cassidy was in the bay. He was looking at the monitor. He was looking at his tablet. He was looking at the patient. He was not doing anything, which was the most dangerous thing a doctor could do in this particular moment. And Dorothy had seen that particular frozen in the headlights expression enough times in her career to know what it meant. He recognized that something was critically wrong and was not yet certain enough of his own read to commit to action, which was a form of clinical paralysis that nurses with 2 decades of experience could identify in under 3 seconds. She had already taken 2 steps toward the bay before she consciously decided to the way the body sometimes makes its most important decisions without waiting for the mind to catch up. Davis put a hand on her arm. "You're done here. That girl is going to die if someone doesn't recognize she's in status epilepticus." "In the next 90 seconds, Dorothy said, without stopping because she was already moving, and Davis's hand was an obstacle she was treating as irrelevant. "Miss Dot." She pulled her arm free, not roughly, just with the clean precision of someone who had made a decision and was finished negotiating, and she walked into Bay 4. Cassidy looked up. His face went through several things at once. How long, Dorothy asked already at the medication cart, already scanning. Maybe 3 minutes. "What did you give her?" 2 milligrams lorazepam. "No. Get 4 more ready." She was already drawing the dose herself, checking the label with the automatic thoroughness of muscle memory. the kind that doesn't require conscious thought because it has been performed so many times that it lives in the hands. And get someone bagging her airway now. Cassidy moved. The other nurse in the bay moved. Dorothy pushed the medication into the IV line and counted to herself, silently, watching the monitor with the focused attention of someone for whom numbers on a screen were a language she had been reading since before most of the current staff had started medical school. 30 seconds. The seizing slowed. 60 seconds. It stopped. The young woman's body went still, not the stillness of death, but the stillness of a body that had been fighting itself for several minutes and had finally been given the chemical permission to stop. And Dorothy was already calling the next steps. CT head phenytoin drip, continuous monitoring before the relief in the room had finished settling. That was when Wall appeared in the doorway. He looked at the patient. He looked at Cassidy. He looked at Dorothy. "Get out," he said. "Now, or I'm calling the police." Dorothy dried her hands at the sink. "She was dying," she said without turning around. "Your resident froze. I did the job. You have no authority here." She turned then because she wanted him to see her face when she said the next thing. "No, I didn't. But I had the training and she's alive because I used it." She walked to the exit. Behind her she heard the automatic doors open and the cool night air of the parking lot come through, and she walked out into it without looking back, because some things only count if you do them without needing to watch what happens next. The parking lot of Millhaven General at 11 at night was the particular kind of empty that still had people in it. A nurse walking to her car in the far section, an ambulance idling near the bay entrance with its lights off, a man smoking near the dumpsters in the way people smoke when they're not supposed to and are hoping nobody notices. And Dorothy walked out into it and stopped and turned and looked back at the building. The fluorescent light through the lobby windows made the whole facade glow in the way that hospitals always glowed at night. That flat, relentless brightness that was designed for the people inside it, and had no concern for how it appeared to anyone standing outside, looking in and through the glass. She could see the ordinary traffic of a late-night ER people moving with purpose, monitors visible above the bay curtains, the nurses' station with its perpetual cluster of clipboards and keyboards and half-drunk coffee cups. She reached into her pocket and felt the small silver pin. She had taken it off her lapel during the meeting with Wall, a habitual automatic gesture the same way you remove a wallet before you go through security, a quiet act of preparation that didn't announce itself. She held it in her palm for a moment and looked at it. The roots and the branches of the oak tree were equal in the design, which was the point which had always been the point. She did not call a lawyer. She did not call the nursing union. She did not call any of the 3 reporters she had phone numbers for from a case 4 years ago when a billing irregularity had briefly made local news. She was not unaware that these were options available to her. She simply knew from the kind of long experience that doesn't come from training, but from living inside a situation over time, that none of those calls would accomplish what needed to be accomplished, and that calling them now in the hot reactive rush of the first hour would likely close more doors than it opened. She took out her phone. She opened her contacts. She scrolled to a name that was listed as a single letter C, and she looked at it for a long moment. Then she put the phone back in her pocket. She was not going to make that call tonight. Not because she didn't trust the number, and not because she wasn't ready, but because the right time for that call was when she had everything in order, and she did not yet have everything in order, and she had learned the difference between acting from urgency and acting from readiness, and she was going to be ready before she moved. She drove home on Route 9 with the radio on low, and somewhere around the 12-minute mark, the news program interrupted itself to note that Attorney General Reeves had concluded a 2-day congressional hearing on healthcare regulatory reform in Washington, and that his testimony had drawn significant attention from both sides of the aisle, and that the Attorney General's office had released a statement indicating continued commitment to federal oversight of patient safety standards. Dorothy turned the radio off. Not because the story bothered her, because she was thinking and she needed the quiet for it. She was constructing in the organized and methodical way that had always been how she processed things a precise account of every clinical decision made in the last 12 hours at Millhaven General, every documented conversation, every timestamp, every name. and by the time she pulled into the small driveway of her house on the west side of town, she had a very clear understanding of exactly what she had and exactly what she still needed. She got out of the car. The night was cool and still. She went inside, went to the kitchen table, and sat down with a legal pad and a pen that was heavy and reliable, the kind that didn't skip, and she began to write. Not because she was angry, because she was preparing. There was a difference, and she had learned it a long time ago in a place that was very far from this parking lot, and the knowledge had never left her. The meeting between Wall-Cross and Cassidy happened in Wall's office at 12:37 in the morning after the ER had settled back into its ordinary rhythm, and the fluorescent lights had stopped feeling like witnesses and started feeling like furniture again. And Cassidy sat in the chair that Dorothy had occupied hours earlier, and looked at the surface of the desk because it was easier than looking at the faces of the people on the other side of it. Wall was direct about what needed to happen because Wall was always direct. It was one of the qualities that people who liked him cited as a virtue, and it was one of the qualities that made what he directed particularly efficient. He told Cassidy that the documentation on the Osei case needed to be revised. Not fabricated, he was careful to use the word revised in the specific tone of voice that signals to a listener that the distinction matters enormously to the speaker and should be extended the courtesy of not being examined too closely. What needed to be removed, Wall explained, was any notation that could be read as indicating a discrepancy between the attending physician's assessment and the patient's actual clinical status, and in particular, any entry that made it appear that a nursing staff member had raised a concern that was subsequently dismissed. The documentation, as corrected, should reflect that Raymond Osei presented with symptoms consistent with anxiety and cardiovascular stress in a patient with known predisposing factors, that the clinical team assessed him appropriately and made reasonable judgments based on the information available at the time, and that the subsequent cardiac event, while serious, represented the unpredictable nature of acute presentations in high-risk patients. Cassidy looked at his hands. Finn Wall said, and the use of his first name was its own kind of pressure, the kind that came wrapped in collegiality. This is straightforward documentation management. This is what risk management exists for. You did nothing wrong tonight. I told her to flag it to you, Cassidy said, and his voice was quieter than either of them wanted it to be. And I assessed the patient and made a clinical determination, Wall said, which is exactly how the chain of command is supposed to work. What you're doing now is ensuring that the record accurately reflects the chain of command. Nothing more. Cassidy went home at 2 in the morning, accessed the hospital's electronic record system from his laptop, and spent 14 minutes revising the Osei file. He deleted Dorothy's nursing notes from the 957 documentation, 3 lines that said precisely and in language that would hold up in any court that she had identified classic PE indicators and recommended CT imaging, and that her recommendation had been declined. He replaced them with 2 lines noting that the patient was assessed by nursing staff as anxious, and that reassurance measures were initiated per attending instruction. He sat in front of his laptop for a while after that, in the particular stillness of a person who has done something they cannot undo and is in the early stages of understanding what that means. What Cassidy did not know, what neither he nor Wall nor Nadine Cross knew, was that the hospital's backup server ran an automatic archiving sweep every night at 3 a.m., pulling copies of all documentation that had been modified in the previous 24 hours and storing them in a secured backup partition that had been installed 18 months earlier by an IT contractor who had been hired specifically because of his experience with healthcare data compliance, and who had designed the system with the particular thoroughness of someone who understood that the value of a backup was inversely proportional to how many people knew it existed. The backup partition saved both versions, the original and the revised. It saved the timestamp of the revision. It saved the user ID of the person who had made the change. It saved everything. Nadine Cross, meanwhile, had called Harold Brixton, the chairman of the hospital's board of directors, at 11:58, while Dorothy was still in the parking lot and Cassidy was still in Wall's office, and the call had lasted 4 minutes, and Brixton had listened in the way that Brixton always listened, which was with the comfortable patience of a man who had been managing situations for a long time and had developed a high tolerance for things that sounded serious. "Is she the kind to make noise?" Brixton asked. "She's a nurse," Nadine said. "She has no institutional standing to file anything significant. The union grievance process takes months. By then this is buried," Brixton said, which was not a question. "Correct. Fine. Keep me posted." The call ended. What neither of them knew as they went about the ordinary mechanics of protecting the institution they believed they were managing was that this was not the first time Dorothy Reeves had been in a situation where people with more institutional power than her had made quiet arrangements to ensure that what she knew stayed where they wanted it to stay. They knew she had worked at Millhaven General for 28 years. They did not know what she had done before that. They did not know what the pin on her lapel meant, or who had given it to her, or what the number engraved on its back corresponded to in a database they had never had reason to know existed. They had assessed her the way Wall assessed his patients on the surface of things, with the confident efficiency of someone who had no reason to look deeper. The backup server hummed in its climate-controlled room and archived everything quietly as designed. And 4 months earlier, before any of this had happened, Dorothy Reeves had filed a preliminary report to the Department of Justice's Medical Integrity Program, flagging Millhaven General for a pattern of documentation irregularities that had come to her attention over the preceding 18 months, and that report had been received, logged, and was currently being reviewed by a unit whose existence was not publicly advertised. She had said nothing to anyone about this. Some preparations were not for sharing. Tara got home at 12:45 in the morning and sat on her couch in her coat for 20 minutes. Before she remembered, she was still wearing it, and she didn't take it off so much as she became aware of it and moved it to the cushion beside her. And then she sat there in the particular quiet of a small apartment at 1 in the morning with the refrigerator humming and the sounds of the city doing whatever the city did at this hour. And a feeling in her chest that she couldn't name precisely, but that she recognized as the feeling of knowing something that she wasn't sure she was supposed to know, or wasn't sure she was allowed to do anything about, which was a feeling she had grown up with in certain contexts and had been hoping somewhere in the back of her mind that professional life might eventually stop producing. She was 26 years old and had been a nurse for 3 years. And she had been at Millhaven General for one of those years, and in that year she had learned 2 things that nobody in nursing school had prepared her for. The first was that the hierarchy in a hospital was considerably more rigid and considerably more personal than any textbook had suggested, and the second was that Dorothy Reeves was the only person she had ever worked with who seemed genuinely unbothered by the first thing, which had made Dorothy simultaneously the most reassuring and the most frightening person in the building. She picked up her phone and opened a text to Dorothy's number, and she typed, "I'm sorry about what happened tonight you didn't deserve," and then she deleted it because it was inadequate, and also because she wasn't sure what she was actually trying to say, which meant she probably shouldn't be saying it yet. She opened her laptop. She typed Millhaven General lawsuit into the search bar and found after some digging through local news archives 3 mentions of settled malpractice cases from the previous 5 years, all described in language that was legally careful and informationally empty in the specific way that settlements produce. One of them listed a surviving family member as plaintiff and used the word undisclosed in connection with the settlement amount, and the name attached to it was Garman. She stared at that for a while. She closed the laptop. She thought about the moment earlier tonight when she had stood in the corridor with her clipboard held against her chest and watched Dorothy walk past her, and about the nod Dorothy had given her. That small, steady nod that didn't ask for anything, that just said, "I see you," and about how in the 3 seconds that nod lasted she had felt more seen than she had in most of the conversations she'd had in the past 6 months. She thought about Raymond Osei lying on the gurney with his eyes tracking Dorothy across the room the way sick people track the person they've identified as actually paying attention to them. She thought about something Dorothy had told her 4 months ago during a slow afternoon shift in the particular offhand way that Dorothy said things she meant seriously. The notes you write today are the only version of events that will exist tomorrow if someone decides to change the story. Write like someone is going to want to change it. Tara opened her laptop again. She didn't close it until almost 3 in the morning. Dorothy was sitting at her kitchen table at 7:43 in the morning with a cup of coffee that had been hot when she poured it and was cold now, which meant she had been sitting at this table writing in the legal pad for longer than she'd intended, though the length of time felt appropriate given what the pages contained. The kitchen was small and orderly in the way of rooms that belong to people who have learned to want less than they technically have space for 1 mug on the counter, 3 books on the small shelf by the window, a single plant on the sill that was of a variety that survived without much attention, which was the kind Dorothy always chose. On the wall beside the doorway was a framed photograph, a man in his early 30s in a gray suit standing on the steps of a building with columns, and the building was recognizable if you knew what to look for, which most people Dorothy's neighbors knew would not, and she had never added a caption or a nameplate to the frame because the photograph was for her, not for visitors. Her phone rang at 7:47. The number was Washington, D.C., and it was not the number she'd been expecting because she'd been expecting a call from her attorney about the termination. But the area code was different from her attorney's, and she recognized the exchange from enough years of association that her hand paused for a fraction of a second before she answered. "Whitmore residence?" she said, which was habit from a different time and a different set of protocols and which she hadn't said in almost 3 years. "Me." The voice on the other end was careful and warm and carried something underneath the warmth that was concern, working hard to stay professional. "It's Caleb." "I heard." In the photograph on the wall, the man in the gray suit was standing very straight with the particular posture of someone who had learned stillness as a form of discipline rather than a natural tendency. And his eyes, even in the photograph, had the quality of taking in more than they revealed, which was something Dorothy recognized because she knew where he had learned it. "Word travels fast," she said. "Word travels to me when someone files a protected report with a federal program and then gets terminated 14 hours later," Caleb said. "That's a flag, Mom. That's an automatic flag. I got a briefing note this morning." Dorothy set down her pen. She had known in the abstract way that you know things about systems you helped design that this mechanism existed, and she had filed the preliminary report knowing it would eventually move through this particular channel. But she had not expected the timeline to collapse this quickly, and she sat with that for a moment. "All right," she said. "Let me tell you what happened." She told him from the beginning, not from the night before, but from 14 months ago from the FAM case, because context was not background noise. It was evidence. And she had never in her life given anyone a partial account of something she needed them to understand completely. She spoke without editorializing, and without emotional inflation, listing events in sequence with the timestamps she had kept, and the documentation she had maintained, and the names attached to each decision and each outcome. And Caleb listened without interrupting, which was something she had taught him when he was 8 years old and which had apparently stuck. When she finished, there was a brief silence. "The backup server," Caleb said. "The revision was made at 2:47 a.m. The backup runs at 3. They didn't know about the backup. Do you have the original documentation?" Dorothy looked at the folder she had taken from her bag and placed on the table before she started writing a manila folder. Unremarkable, held closed with a rubber band containing printed copies of every note she had written on the Osei case. Time-stamped and initialed, printed the morning before her shift, which was something she had done on every significant case for the past 14 months because she had known with the quiet, patient certainty of someone who has been watching something build for a long time that this day was coming. "I have everything," she said. Another silence, shorter this time. She could hear in the particular quality of Caleb's breathing the shift from son to official. Not a replacement, a layering, the same shift she heard in his voice when he moved from a conversation about family into the part of the conversation about work, and she recognized it because she had the same shift, and he had inherited it from her. "I'm going to need you to not go anywhere today," he said. "Don't contact the hospital. Don't contact their legal team. Don't talk to the press if they call. Someone from our medical integrity unit is going to come to you within the next 4 hours. Her name is Donna Price, and she's going to ask you to verify your identity using a protocol you'll recognize. The protocol's still the same. We updated it 18 months ago, but the PIN still works as the physical identifier. Dorothy looked at her hand, where the small silver pin was sitting on the table beside the legal pad she had placed it there when she sat down another habit. "All right," she said. "Mom." His voice shifted again, just slightly back toward the other layer. "You filed that preliminary report 6 months ago. You've been building this case for over a year. You knew this was going to happen. I knew it was likely to happen. Why didn't you tell me earlier?" She picked up her cold coffee and drank it anyway because it was coffee. And she had always believed in not wasting coffee regardless of the temperature. "Because you're the Attorney General of the United States," she said, "and I wasn't going to use that to protect myself before I had something worth protecting." A longer silence this time. 4 hours, Caleb said. "Donna Price, don't open the door to anyone else. I know how this works. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. Go do your job, Caleb. You go do yours first." The call ended. Dorothy set the phone on the table beside the folder and the pin and the legal pad, and she sat in the silence of the kitchen for a moment, looking at the photograph on the wall. The man in the gray suit with the straight posture and the eyes that took in more than they showed. And she thought not for the first time that he had grown into someone she would have admired even if she hadn't raised him, which was the thing about children that nobody warned you about, the possibility of being surprised by who they became. She picked up her pen and went back to writing. She still had things to get in order. The knock came at 11:42 in the morning. 3 knocks evenly spaced, neither urgent nor tentative, the kind of knock that announced itself without performing anything. And Dorothy had been expecting it for the last 40 minutes, which was approximately when she had finished with the legal pad and moved to making herself lunch that she wasn't particularly hungry for. She opened the door. Donna Price was 40 years old and had the kind of face that people forgot immediately after looking at it. Which was not an accident. It was the product of years of deliberately avoiding the kinds of grooming and presentation choices that made faces memorable of finding the precise midpoint between every aesthetic category and staying there. She was wearing a gray jacket and dark slacks and no visible badge, and she was carrying a messenger bag that could have belonged to anyone doing anything. And she looked at Dorothy with calm, assessing eyes and said, "Good morning. I wonder if you could show me the piece of jewelry I understand you sometimes wear on your left lapel." Dorothy reached into the pocket of her cardigan and produced the pin. Price took it, turned it over, examined the back with the brief and practiced attention of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. On the back of the pin, in characters small enough to require good light to read, was a 10-digit number that had been engraved there 15 years ago in a facility in Virginia that no longer officially existed. "Confirmed," Price said, and handed the pin back. "Dorothy Reeves, registered under Protocol 7, as of September 2009. I'm Donna Price, DOJ Medical Integrity Unit. May I come in?" Dorothy stepped back and held the door open. They sat at the kitchen table, which was still scattered with the materials of Dorothy's morning. The legal pad, the folder. The pen and Price opened her messenger bag and took out a laptop and a small recording device, which she placed on the table and looked at Dorothy over. "Before we begin," Price said, "I need to confirm the nature of your involvement with this program. You were a voluntary civilian consultant from 2009 to 2018, primarily in a documentation and advisory capacity for cases involving healthcare facility irregularities in the Southeast region. You transitioned to retired status in 2018 when you took the position at Millhaven General. Is that accurate?" "That's accurate. And the preliminary report you filed 6 months ago was filed through the standard Protocol 7 channel, yes. I identified a pattern of documentation anomalies at Millhaven General that I believed warranted a formal inquiry, and I filed the report and returned to my regular duties and waited." Price nodded. "What you may not have known when you filed is that your report arrived during an active investigation that the Medical Integrity Unit had already opened for a separate reason. Medicare billing irregularities identified by an audit contractor 8 months before your report came in. Your report provided a clinical context for what had previously looked like a financial pattern. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. How many cases? We have identified 23 cases over the past 5 years with what we'd describe as a consistent pattern. Patient complications or deaths following situations in which nursing staff raised clinical concerns. Those concerns were overridden by attending physicians, and the subsequent documentation was altered or removed to reflect the attending's original assessment rather than the clinical outcome. The kitchen was very still. The refrigerator hummed. The plant on the windowsill was in a patch of sunlight. 23, Dorothy said. 3 of them resulted in patient deaths that we believe were preventable. 2 resulted in permanent injury. The remaining 18 involve complications of varying severity. Price looked at her carefully. You are the 6th clinical staff member to be terminated from Millhaven General following the documentation of a patient safety concern. You are the first one we have been able to reach with complete contemporaneous documentation intact. Because I kept everything. Because you kept everything, Price agreed. She opened her laptop. Mrs. Reeves, this morning, someone accessed and modified the OSE patient file. We believe we know who did it, and we believe we can prove it, but we need your original documentation as the baseline for comparison. The folder on the table, Dorothy slid it across. Price opened it, scanned the first page, and looked up. Ba biet de la bang chung kwa mo toi hin su kong. Yes, Dorothy said. I know. They sat together for the better part of 3 hours, Dorothy and Price, at the kitchen table with the laptop open between them and the folder's contents spread in careful order, and Price took Dorothy through what the Medical Integrity Unit had assembled over the previous 14 months, with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that the value of information was entirely dependent on how well it was organized. And Dorothy listened with the focused, still attention of someone who had been doing their own version of this organizing in parallel and was now for the first time seeing the full shape of what she had only been looking at pieces of. The 23 cases were not 23 isolated incidents. They were, when laid in sequence with their dates and their staff assignments and their documentation patterns, something that a careful reader would recognize as a process, a repeating mechanism for turning clinical error into institutional immunity through the targeted removal of any record that complicated the preferred narrative. The mechanism worked in stages. First, a patient presented with symptoms that a nurse, almost always a senior nurse with significant experience, identified as requiring a specific intervention that the attending physician declined. Second, the patient deteriorated in the manner that the nurse had predicted. Third, after the outcome was established, the clinical record was revised to reflect the attending's original assessment, rather than the nurse's concern, so that any subsequent review of the case would show a single consistent clinical narrative rather than a disagreement. Fourth, the nurse who had raised the concern was typically placed on a performance improvement plan, or issued a formal warning for insubordination, or in 6 cases including Dorothy's terminated. The pattern was not invisible to anyone who looked for it across the full span of years. What had made it invisible was that nobody had looked across the full span of years because the cases were separated by months, and the nurses involved were different people each time, and within the limited view of any individual case, what you saw was a personnel dispute that had been resolved administratively and a clinical outcome that had been reviewed internally and deemed within acceptable parameters. It was only when you laid all 23 next to each other with their timestamps and their names and their documentation before and after that the shape of the thing became clear. Price showed her the Walter Garman case, the name that had appeared in Dorothy's own files, the 70-year-old man who had died 4 months ago from post-surgical complications that Dorothy had flagged as high risk in writing 24 hours before the surgery, and whose file had been subsequently revised to indicate that the nursing staff had raised no specific pre-surgical concerns. Then the Linda Pham case. Then the Raymond Osei case, now with 2 versions of the record side by side, the original that Dorothy had printed the morning before her shift, and the revised version that Cassidy had created at 2:47 in the morning. And the difference between the two documents was 3 lines in Dorothy's handwriting that described with clinical precision exactly what had happened and exactly who had dismissed it. Dorothy looked at those 2 versions for a long time without speaking. The backup server, she finally said, retained both versions with timestamps Price confirmed. The system contractor who installed it built in a modification log for exactly this reason. He also, as it happens, filed a voluntary disclosure with our office 6 months ago, mentioning that he had reason to believe the system might be capturing evidence of exactly this kind of activity. He filed a disclosure. Apparently, he had been doing Millhaven General's IT contract work for 3 years and had seen enough anomalies in the modification logs to be concerned. Price's expression was neutral, but held a quality of careful restraint, as if she was working to not say something more. He's been cooperative. Dorothy sat back in her chair. Outside the kitchen window, the late morning light was doing something with the leaves on the small tree in her backyard that turned them 3 different shades of green at once, and she watched it for a moment. "The 3 who died," she said. "Do the families know?" "Not the full scope of it. They know there was a loss. They were told it was a clinical outcome within acceptable parameters." Price was quiet for a moment. The Garman family filed a wrongful death suit that was settled for an amount that included a non-disclosure agreement. And they signed it. They were grieving, and they were offered money, and they were told by a hospital lawyer that going to court would be expensive and uncertain and take years. People sign things in that situation. Dorothy nodded slowly. She had known all of this in the approximate way you know things you have inferred from fragments over time. Hearing it stated in sequence, confirmed and documented, was different from inferring it. It had a weight that inference didn't have. She placed her hand flat on the table beside the folder, beside the legal pad, beside the small silver pin she had set down when she came inside this morning. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Your testimony," Price said, "your documentation, and your patience for approximately 48 more hours while we finish building the case to a point where it can withstand what's going to happen when we move." And after 48 hours, Price looked at her. "After 48 hours, we move." The meeting that Wall called at 8 in the morning, the day after Dorothy's termination, was described on the internal scheduling system as an ER staff communication session, which was a category of meeting that happened quarterly and was understood by everyone who attended them to be somewhere between a pep talk and a warning, depending on what had recently occurred, and the staff assembled in the small conference room on the ground floor, with the collective posture of people who already knew the general subject matter and were trying to calculate individually and without visible coordination how much of it was going to require a response from them. There were 14 people in the room. Tara Bloom sat near the back beside a traveling nurse named Pierre, who had only been at Millhaven General for 6 weeks, and therefore had no context for anything, and kept his expression carefully neutral as a result. Opal Grant, who had been an ER nurse for 23 years, and was the second most senior floor nurse after Dorothy, sat in the front row with her arms folded and her expression set in the particular configuration that people who knew her recognized as active and somewhat skeptical attention. Wall stood at the front. He spoke for 11 minutes. The subject nominally was professional boundaries and clinical communication, and the content was a careful and well-constructed statement about the importance of respecting the chain of command, about the difference between clinical advocacy and clinical overreach, about how the ER operated as a team in which every member played a defined role, and the effectiveness of the team depended on those roles being respected, and about how recent events had highlighted the need for a refreshed collective understanding of these principles. He did not say Dorothy's name. He did not explicitly reference any specific incident. He used the word recent 3 times, which was enough for everyone in the room to understand exactly what he was talking about, and he used the phrase moving forward 4 times, which was enough for everyone in the room to understand exactly what he wanted from them about it. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Opal Grant said without unfolding her arms, "How is Mr. Osei doing?" Wall's gaze moved to her. Mr. Osai is receiving excellent care in the ICU. I understand that, Opal said. I'm asking about his current condition. He's stable. His chart says he's in a medically induced coma following a cardiac event. Stable, as I said. Opal tilted her head slightly. The gesture was small and somehow more pointed than anything louder would have been. I just wanted to make sure we had a shared understanding of what stable meant in this context. The room did not make a sound. Wall's hand came down on the table in his characteristic way, flat, deliberate, a period at the end of a sentence, and he said that the meeting was concluded, and that he appreciated everyone's time, and people gathered their things and moved toward the door with the subdued efficiency of a group that had just witnessed something that had been heard but not in any official sense said. After the meeting, Tara came out of the conference room to find Cassidy waiting for her in the corridor. He had the expression of someone who had rehearsed this conversation and was discovering in real time that the rehearsal hadn't adequately prepared him for the actual thing. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay," Cassidy said. "Last night was a lot." "I'm fine," Tara said. "It's important that everyone's aligned on what happened. For the sake of the patients, for the continuity of care, it's better if we all have a consistent understanding of events." Tara looked at him. She was 26, but she had grown up in a family where people spoke around things rather than about them, and she had spent 3 years learning to hear the gap between what was said and what was meant, and the gap in what Cassidy was currently saying was large enough to park something in. "I have a clear memory of what happened," she said pleasantly. "I don't think I'm going to have any trouble with consistency." Cassidy held her gaze for a moment, trying to read what she meant, and then he nodded and said, "Good, that's good," and walked away. And Tara watched him go with the careful expression of someone who had just confirmed something she had already suspected. Across town, in a small house with a kitchen table and a legal pad, and a folder and a laptop and a federal agent named Donna Price Dorothy Reeves was still working. And in the backup server in the climate-controlled room that nobody was thinking about, everything was still being saved. Ruth Osei had been in the hospital for 37 hours. She had a sister who had offered to come and sit with her, and a neighbor who had offered to bring food, and a pastor who had called twice and whose voicemail she had listened to and not returned. And she had declined all of these things, not because she didn't want company, but because leaving the hospital even briefly felt like a form of abandonment that she couldn't make herself commit, as if her physical presence in the waiting area outside the ICU was doing something for Raymond that she couldn't exactly articulate but deeply believed. The ICU waiting room at Millhaven General was a small space with chairs upholstered in a fabric that had been chosen for durability rather than comfort, and a window that faced a parking structure and a television mounted too high on the wall that played cable news on low volume, and a coffee machine that produced a product that was technically coffee in the same way that a photograph of a meal was technically food. Ruth had been through 3 cups of it. She had slept for perhaps 4 hours in the chair leaning against the wall with her cloth purse in her lap, and she had spent the rest of the time alternately watching the doors of the ICU and watching her phone and watching the faces of the staff who came in and out and who had, with the exception of a few brief and carefully managed interactions, given her no information beyond a series of variations on the phrase, "We're monitoring him closely." What she had not been given was an explanation, not a real one. She had been told that Raymond had experienced a cardiac event, that he was in a medically induced coma, to allow his heart to rest and stabilize, that the cardiologist would be speaking with her in the morning. And all of this was probably true and was entirely insufficient, because what Ruth Osei needed was not a clinical briefing, but an account, a coherent, honest account of what had happened, and why, which was a thing that nobody in the hospital had yet offered her. On the afternoon of the second day, Tara came through the ICU wing on a non-patient errand and noticed Ruth sitting in the same chair she had been sitting in the last time Tara had come through, and something in the way Ruth was holding herself, the absolute exhausted stillness of someone who has made their peace with waiting as the only form of agency available to them, made Tara stop. She sat down in the chair beside Ruth. She didn't say anything immediately. Sometimes the first thing you offered was not words. After a few minutes, Ruth said, without looking at her, "They keep telling me he's stable." "He is," Tara said carefully. "His heart is maintaining its rhythm with support. That's real." "But he went in." "Healthy," Ruth said. "He drives himself here. He's talking. He's a little scared, but he's talking." And then she stopped. "They told me he had a cardiac event. They told me it was unpredictable. But I keep thinking about something." Tara waited. "There was a nurse," Ruth said, "when he first came in, an older woman. Silver hair, she spent time with him. She took his hand. She was looking at the monitor like she knew exactly what she was seeing. And then she said something to a younger doctor, and the doctor walked away, and then a man came in and told her to leave. And they took him out to wait, and then Ruth pressed her lips together for a moment. I could see she was worried. Even when they walked her out, she stood at the corridor and looked back at him. And I remember thinking, that woman is worried, and they're not listening to her. And then an hour later, the alarm was going off. The waiting room was quiet. The TV murmured something about overseas weather patterns. Tara kept her hands still in her lap. She was thinking about a lot of things simultaneously, about Cassidy's conversation in the corridor that morning, about the word consistent, about the email she had drafted and sent the night before, and that was now, she assumed, somewhere in a federal inbox being read by someone she had never met and would probably never speak to. "What was her name?" Ruth asked. "The nurse." "Do you know her?" "Dorothy Reeves," Tara said. Ruth turned to look at her for the first time. "Does she still work here?" Tara met her eyes. She thought about how to answer this honestly without saying more than she should, and she thought about Dorothy's voice. "The notes you write today are the only version of events that will exist tomorrow if someone decides to change the story." And she decided that Ruth Osei had already been lied to by omission for 37 hours and didn't need another lie, even a careful one. "No," Tara said. "She doesn't." Ruth held her gaze for a long moment, and something moved through her face. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation. The look of someone who had already suspected the shape of something and was now seeing it clearly for the first time. And then she turned back to the window that faced the parking structure. "I want to find her," Ruth said quietly. "To thank her." Tara nodded slowly. She did not say that finding Dorothy was at this moment considerably more possible than either of them knew. She did not say what she had sent the night before, or who might be reading it, or what was building quietly and with great precision in a direction that none of the people running this hospital had yet thought to look. She just sat with Ruth Osei in the small waiting room with the uncomfortable chairs and let the afternoon pass and held carefully all the things she knew that weren't yet hers to say. The email was still in her sent folder when she checked the next morning, which was the first thing she did after waking, before coffee, before the news, before anything. And seeing it there, time-stamped and irrevocable, produced a feeling she hadn't expected, which was not dread, but something more like relief. The specific relief of having done something you've been deciding whether to do for long enough that the decision itself was costing you energy you needed for other things. She had sent it to the Office of the Inspector General for the Department of Health and Human Services, which was the address listed on the Federal Healthcare Whistleblower reporting form that she had found on the HHS website at 11:45 the previous night, after reading enough of the publicly available guidance to feel reasonably confident that what she was about to do had legal protection behind it, even if she couldn't completely predict what would happen next. The email had taken her 2 hours to write, which was not because she wasn't sure what to say, but because she was trying to say it precisely in the same kind of language that Dorothy always used, the kind where every word was doing specific work, and nothing was approximate, because she had spent enough time watching Dorothy write notes to understand that precision was its own kind of protection. She had described in sequence the events of the evening with Raymond Osei, including the specific interaction between Dorothy and Cassidy at 9:57 p.m., and her own witnessing of it from approximately 15 feet away. Cassidy's approach to her in the corridor the following morning, and the specific phrasing he had used about consistency. Her observation that the electronic chart on the medication station, which she had briefly accessed for an unrelated patient query, showed a modification timestamp from 2:47 a.m. on a night when the modification would have had to be made by someone with supervisor-level access to the OSA record. And her general observations going back 6 months of a pattern of senior nursing staff raising concerns that were dismissed and then subsequently facing formal or informal professional consequences. She did not speculate. She did not use language like "I think" or "I believe." She used "I observed" and "I witnessed" and "the documentation shows" and "the timestamp indicates," because those were the kinds of phrases that created records rather than impressions. She had also, and this was the part that had taken her the longest to decide, included her own name and contact information, because she knew that anonymous reports generated different kinds of responses than identified ones, and because she had decided somewhere around 1 a.m, when the decision finally settled, that she was not going to do this halfway. Dorothy had told her something once during a slow shift 3 months ago that had lodged in the back of her mind and stayed there like a stone in a pocket. The people who do things part way have the worst of both worlds. They carry the risk without the effect. If you're going to do something, do it all the way or don't do it. Tara had done it all the way. She got up and made coffee and stood in her kitchen with the cup warm between both hands and thought about what the day at work was going to look like now, and whether Cassidy would approach her again, and whether Wall could somehow know, and whether the protections she had read about at 11:45 in the morning were as real as the website had suggested, or whether they were one of those institutional promises that looked solid on paper and dissolved when you actually needed them. She thought about Ruth Osei in the waiting room with her cloth purse and her 37 hours of waiting for information that she had not yet been given. She thought about the name in the search results Garmin and the settled lawsuit and the non-disclosure agreement. She thought about a 22-year-old woman whose seizures had been controlled in Bay 4 by a woman who had been escorted out of the building 20 minutes later. She finished her coffee. She got dressed. She drove to work. In the car, she listened to the morning news, which had nothing about Millhaven General and nothing about any federal health care investigation, and nothing about any attorney general's office doing anything that would have told her whether her email had landed anywhere or whether it had gone into a system that was as indifferent as every other institutional system she'd ever encountered. She parked in the hospital lot. She sat in the car for a moment. She thought about the nod Dorothy had given her in the corridor, that small, steady, "I see you," that didn't ask for anything in return. And then she got out of the car and went in. She had done what she was going to do. Now she worked. That was what Dorothy would have done. That was, in fact, what Dorothy had done for 14 months, filing reports and keeping copies and writing notes in handwriting that would hold up under scrutiny and continuing to show up every day and do the work, because the doing of the work was its own kind of testimony to what she believed the work was supposed to be. Tara clocked in and picked up her clipboard and started her shift. The free clinic was 22 miles from Millhaven General on a state highway that ran through the kind of landscape that people from the city described as rural, and people from the area simply called home small farms and tree lines and mailboxes at the ends of dirt roads, and a general store that also sold bait, and eventually a single-story building with a sign that said, Drover County Community Health Clinic, in letters that had faded slightly from the sun, sitting on a half-acre lot, with 4 parking spaces and a bench outside the entrance where someone had left a potted plant that was doing better than might be expected given the November temperature. Price drove. Dorothy rode in the passenger seat. They had called ahead, which Price had wanted to do, and Dorothy had suggested not doing, and the compromise was that Price had called to confirm the clinic's hours, without giving a specific reason for the visit. And now they were here, and through the window of the examination room, visible from the parking lot. Dorothy could see a figure in a white coat moving with the particular focused economy of a doctor who had learned to work in a space where everything they needed had to be where they put it, because there was no extra staff to find things and no supply room 20 feet away. Evelyn Marsh was 55 years old, with close-cropped gray hair and the lean, slightly angular look of someone who had been under sustained stress for long enough that it had reorganized their face into something more definitive than it had probably started as. She had trained at a good medical school, had completed a strong residency, and had spent 3 years at Millhaven General before what her personnel file described in the careful language of institutions protecting themselves as a mutual agreement to transition to an external placement opportunity. Dorothy knew from the records Price had shown her that what the personnel file did not describe was the meeting in which Marsh had refused to sign a post-incident summary on the Walter Garman case that she believed misrepresented the clinical facts, and the subsequent weeks in which the professional environment around her had become what Marsh had later described in a written account that she had kept but not yet submitted to anyone as a steady and unambiguous pressure campaign designed to make staying more painful than leaving. She had left. She had ended up here. She looked up when Dorothy and Price appeared in the doorway of the exam room, and whatever she had been expecting, a supplier, a patient, a lost traveler. She visibly recalibrated in the first second of seeing Dorothy's face, and something in her expression shifted from professional neutrality into something more complicated and considerably older. Dr. Reeves Marsh said, which was not Dorothy's title, and which Marsh clearly knew, but which felt in the moment like the most honest way she could think to say, "I see exactly what you are and what this means." "Dr. Marsh," Dorothy said. They sat in the small office beside the exam room, the three of them, and Marsh told them about Walter Garman with the particular directness of someone who had been keeping a thing in a box for a long time, and found now that the box was open that the telling came out faster than she expected. Garman had been 70, had come in for what should have been a straightforward procedure, had experienced a complication that Marsh believed, and had documented, was directly related to a medication interaction that she had flagged preoperatively, and that the attending surgeon had dismissed. He had died 3 days post-surgery. Marsh had submitted an incident report. She had been called into a meeting with Wall and Nadine Cross, and had been presented with an alternative version of the preoperative record that did not include her flagged concern, and had been asked to review it and confirm its accuracy. She had said she could not confirm what was not accurate. The weeks that followed had been what they had been. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk and took out a folder held closed with a rubber band and set it on the desk between them. 3 years she had kept it. She had never shown it to anyone. Dorothy looked at the folder. Then she looked at Marsh. "You weren't going to just let this go," Dorothy said. It was not a question. "I was waiting," Marsh said. "I didn't know for what. For someone to come through the door who could do something with it." She paused. "I saw the news this morning about the termination, and I thought if they finally went after her, then it means they're either very confident or very scared." "Which is it?" Price asked. Marsh looked at her. "Both," she said. "And scared makes them dangerous, but it also makes them sloppy." Dorothy picked up the folder. The IT specialist, Price, had brought in a woman in her 30s named Kim, who communicated almost exclusively in statements that were shorter than 10 words, had been working with the Millhaven General server backup for 6 hours before she found the thing that made her stop typing and say to no one in particular, "Huh." Price looked up from the adjacent table. "What modification log's cleaner than I expected?" "Clean is bad, except it's not." Kim turned her laptop around. Whoever did the revision at 2:47 a.m. deleted the nursing notes and rewrote the entry. But they didn't know the backup partition captures a change signature, not just the content of the revision, but the specific user ID and terminal access code of the person who made the change embedded in the file metadata. Price looked at the screen. The metadata was displaying in a format that required knowing what you were looking at, and Price had been doing this long enough to know what she was looking at. "That's Cassidy's user ID, confirmed. Terminal access from an off-site login, so he did it from home, not the hospital. Home IP address is registered to an apartment building in the Riverside district." Kim pulled up a second window. "And this is the original file retained in the backup with the original timestamp and Dorothy Reeves's nursing notes intact. 3 lines. Price leaned closer and read. "Patient presenting with classic PE indicators. Irregular pulse, incremental, BP drop, onset without exertion. CT angiogram urgently recommended. Dr. Cassidy informed at 21:57. Recommendation declined. She sat back. Then she looked at the second version, the revised one. Patient anxious per assessment. Reassurance measures initiated per attending instruction. BP within acceptable range. The two documents existed in the same system, both dated from the same night, with a 2-hour gap between them. The first was the truth. The second was the version that would have been the only version if the backup system had not existed. How long would it take to recover the full modification history across the OSE file and cross-reference it with the other 23 cases we've flagged? Price asked. Kim considered. With the access we have right now, 14 hours. Do it. Kim turned back to her laptop. Price picked up her phone and called the supervising attorney in the AG's Washington office, a man named Heller, who had been running the medical integrity unit for 11 years, and who answered his phone with the same 2 words regardless of the time or the content of the call. What's there? We have confirmed falsification of patient records with authenticated user ID and timestamp, Price said. We have the original documentation intact in backup. We have a cooperating witness with physical documentation on a second case. And we have a preliminary match between the modification pattern in the OSE case and the patterns in at least 4 of the other flagged cases. Silence on the line. Then, the nurse they terminated. Yes. She filed the preliminary report 6 months ago. Correct. And she kept the original documentation. She printed it the morning before her shift. She does it on every significant case. Price paused. She's been preparing for this for a long time, Mr. Heller. Another brief silence. Who's the AG contact on this? This is in his district. I put the briefing note through this morning, Price said, and something in her voice shifted slightly in the particular way that voices shift when information is about to be offered that the other person might not have connected yet. The AG contact is Caleb Reeves. Silence. The nurse's last name is Reeves, Heller said. Yes. Is that yes? A longer silence. Price could hear Heller rearranging his understanding of the situation in real time, the way you could hear people do that if you paid attention. The small pause where one framework was replaced with another. That was either a very deliberate decision, Heller said slowly, or the most consequential coincidence in this division's recent history. It was deliberate, Price said. She filed the preliminary report and told nobody. She documented everything and told nobody. She prepared for over a year and she waited. For what? Price looked across the room to where Kim was typing with the efficient speed of someone who had found the thread and was pulling it. For it to be undeniable, Price said. She needed it to be so clearly documented, so thoroughly evidenced that there was no way to dismiss it as a disgruntled employee with a grievance. She was building a case, not making a complaint, and the termination yesterday. Was the last piece. They eliminated the one person whose documentation could connect everything. They thought they were closing the problem. Price watched Kim pull up another file, another modification log, another timestamp. They were opening the door. She heard Heller make a sound that was not quite a word, more like the sound of a conclusion arriving. Get the warrants ready, he said. I want to move within 48 hours. The call ended. Across the table, Kim said without looking up from her screen. Found 2 more. The call happened on a Thursday evening between a man in a corner office in a law firm on the east side of the city and a man sitting in an Adirondack chair on the back porch of a house that had been in his family for 40 years. And neither of them knew that the call was being recorded, which was the most expensive oversight either of them would ever make. Harold Brixton had been chairman of the Millhaven General Board of Directors for 7 years, a tenure that had been, from a financial standpoint, successful by most measures. The hospital had expanded its credit rating, had improved its operating surplus, had grown, and the legal exposure from patient liability cases had been through a combination of aggressive settlement strategy and careful management of internal documentation kept consistently below the threshold that would attract the kind of institutional attention that disrupted operations. He was 64, with the tanned, well-maintained appearance of a man who played golf twice a week and had a good relationship with his cardiologist, and he held the particular variety of institutional confidence that comes from decades of navigating the intersection of money and power in the way that people who operate in that intersection often confuse with competence. He had received a call from a contact at the county courthouse earlier that afternoon. Not a lawyer, just someone who worked in the building and who had mentioned in the casually informational way that people with access to courthouse gossip sometimes share things with people they knew, that there had been some unusual federal activity around the healthcare sector recently, some kind of billing inquiry being handled out of the AG's office. This was the information Brixton was now passing to Wall. "It's billing," Wall said. "We've handled billing reviews before. The compliance team has everything documented." "I'm not questioning the billing," Brixton said. "But billing reviews sometimes become other things when they pull the underlying records. The underlying records are clean." Brixton was quiet for a moment. On the porch behind him, a night bird was making itself heard in the tree line, and the sound was pleasant in the specific way that sounds are pleasant when you're sitting in your family home and have no immediate reason to believe that anything can touch you. "Cassidy," he said. "Is he solid?" Wall's fingers came down on something. Brixton could hear it, the flat, deliberate tap that was his habit. He did what he was told. "That's not what I asked. He's 20 months out of residency. He has student debt and a car payment and an apartment lease," Wall said. "He does what he's told because not doing what he's told costs more than doing it, until it doesn't." "Harold, I've managed these situations for 7 years," Brixton said, and his voice had taken on the measured, controlled quality of a man who was working hard to stay calm, which was different from the natural calm of a man who had no reason to be otherwise. "I know how they go wrong. They go wrong when someone who has been doing what they're told decides that doing something different costs them less than continuing. And right now, the people deciding what things cost are not us." Wall was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" Wall asked. "I want to know if there's anything out there that connects me directly to the documentation decisions." Brixton paused. "The emails between me and Nadine about the Garmin case, and the Kessler case before that. Are those on the hospital server?" "They're on the hospital server." "Can they be deleted?" A brief silence. "Nadine handles that kind of thing. Then have Nadine handle it." Neither of them said anything for a moment. The nightbird continued its commentary from the tree line, and the Adirondack chair creaked slightly as Brixton shifted his weight, and somewhere in a building in Washington, on a server that Brixton did not know existed. The audio file of this phone call was being automatically time-stamped and added to a folder that already contained 73 pages of documentary evidence and 2 witness statements and a server modification log with authenticated user IDs. "There's something else," Brixton said. "The nurse, Reeves. I've been thinking about the name since Nadine mentioned it." "Reeves. What about it? Do you know who the Attorney General is?" A pause. "Of course I know who the Attorney General is. His name is Reeves," Brixton said. "Caleb Reeves." Another pause, longer this time. "That's a common enough name," Wall said, but his voice had changed slightly in the way voices change when the confidence in them is recalculating. "I'm sure it is," Brixton said. "I'm probably being cautious about nothing." He paused. "Delete the emails, Preston. Tonight." The call ended. In the building in Washington, the audio file was saved. In the server backup room at Millhaven General, the email deletion, which Nadine Cross would attempt at 11:42 that night, would be logged, time-stamped, and added to the modification record alongside the user ID of the person who had attempted it, because that was what the backup system had been built to do, and it did not stop doing it because someone wanted it to. The nightbird in the tree line behind Brixton's house kept on. He sat in the Adirondack chair a while longer, looking at the dark, and did not know that the thing he was most afraid of had already happened, and that the best decision available to him had already passed. The morning started ordinarily at Millhaven General, which was the particular ordinary of a place that had no reason to expect that Thursday would be any different from Wednesday. And the ER ran its 7 a.m. shift change with the standard briefing and the standard handoffs and the standard complaints about the coffee machine on the second floor, and Wall walked through the department at 8:15 with the deliberate, unhurried pace that announced authority without requiring a word, and everything in his manner suggested a man who had spoken to Harold Brixton the night before and had decided on the basis of that conversation that whatever was coming was manageable. The feeling lasted until 9:47. Nadine Cross was in her office on the third floor when her phone rang, the direct line, not the internal system, and the number was a Washington area code that she did not recognize, and she answered it with the professional neutrality she applied to all unknown numbers, and listened to a voice she also did not recognize, which belonged to a woman from the AG's press office, who was calling to inform her as a professional courtesy that the Attorney General's office would be conducting a site visit to Millhaven General today, and that she wanted to ensure there would be appropriate coordination with hospital administration. Nadine Cross, to her credit, kept her voice entirely level for the duration of the call. She said thank you for the notice, and we'll make sure everything is in order, and of course, absolutely. And then she hung up the phone and sat very still for approximately 4 seconds, and then she picked up the phone again and called Wall. The exchange was brief. Wall's response was to his credit also measured. He said he was sure it was routine. He said the billing documentation was clean. He said they had handled worse. He said he would be in the lobby. At 10:23, a black SUV with government plates and no visible insignia pulled into the ambulance bay and parked in a spot not designated for regular vehicles, and nobody challenged it because the two people who might have were both looking at their phones when it happened. Caleb Reeves stepped out. He was 34 years old, with the build of someone who had been athletic in college and had stayed consistent about it since, and he was wearing a white Oxford shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. No jacket, no tie, and the DOJ badge clipped to his belt was the only mark of office visible on him, and he moved through the lobby entrance with a pace that was neither fast nor slow, but that had in it the quality of someone who had decided exactly where they were going before they left the car. Tara saw him first. She was at the nurse's station updating a medication log, and she looked up because the automatic doors opened and the person who came through them had the kind of presence that registered on peripheral vision before the conscious mind had gotten involved. And she looked at him for a moment without knowing who he was, only knowing that whoever he was, the energy he brought into the room was different from the energy that had been in the room before. She looked at his eyes. They were the same eyes as Dorothy's. Not the color, not the shape exactly, but the quality, the particular way they took in the room without advertising that they were doing it. The combination of attentiveness and restraint that she had seen in Dorothy's face every day for a year, and had come to associate with a kind of intelligence that operated below the surface of what it showed. She looked at his badge. She read the name. She set down her pen very carefully, as if it were fragile. Caleb walked to the nurse's station and said calmly to the first staff member who met his gaze, which happened to be Tara, "I need to speak with Dr. Wall, Ms. Cross, and Mr. Brixton. All three same room. Can you let them know?" His voice was not loud and was not quiet. It was the voice of a person for whom volume was a tool to be calibrated rather than a default expression of anything. Tara said, "Of course," and reached for the phone. Wall arrived in the conference room first with his particular stride and his particular jaw, and he looked at Caleb Reeves standing near the window with one of the 4 other people who had come in with him. A woman in a gray jacket who was looking at a tablet, and 2 men who were standing in the specific configuration of people who are not there to sit down. And Wall did the thing that people of his particular type always did in the first seconds of an unexpected situation. He assessed the power differential and determined based on what he could see where he sat in it. What he saw was a man 20 years younger than him without a jacket in a room that Wall considered his room, and the assessment he made was the last comfortable assessment he would make for a very long time. He extended his hand. Caleb took it. Attorney General Reeves Wall said in the smooth, collegial tone of a man greeting a powerful guest. "I have to admit this is a surprise. I wasn't aware we had anything on the schedule." "We don't," Caleb said pleasantly. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat in it, which was the chair that Wall typically occupied, and Wall registered this with a stillness in his expression that was its own kind of reaction. A thin folder landed on the table. Caleb did not open it. "I'd prefer to let you start," Caleb said. "If there's anything you'd like to tell me before I open this, now would be the time." Wall sat down across from him. He folded his hands on the table. He smiled the smile of a man who was entirely confident and did not know yet that the confidence was a garment he had already lost. "I'm not sure what this is regarding," Wall said. Caleb looked at him for a moment. "All right," he said, and opened the folder. He read from it without looking up, and the reading had a quality that was more like testimony than recitation. Not flat, not performed, but careful in the way that things are careful when every word in them has been verified before being spoken. Name, date, patient outcome, name of the clinical staff member who had documented a concern, name of the physician who had dismissed it, subsequent modification to the patient record. Outcome, 23 times. The room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when the silence is not about the absence of sound, but about the weight of what's being said into it, and the three people sitting across from Caleb Wallcross Brixton, who had arrived last and was sitting with the careful stillness of a man trying to project calm with insufficient material, were each responding differently to what they were hearing, and he noted each response without comment. Wall's hands were still. His face was controlled. He had Caleb observed the discipline of someone who had been in difficult meetings before and knew how to keep his expression from providing information. What he couldn't control because it was involuntary and below his threshold of awareness was the rhythm of his right hand's fingers, which had been performing their characteristic tap against the table at the opening of the meeting and had somewhere around the fifth case stopped entirely. Cross was looking at the table. She had looked at the table since approximately the third case. Her jaw was set in the particular configuration of someone who has made a decision to maintain composure and is succeeding, but at cost. Brixton was the most interesting of the three because he was doing the most work to appear as if he wasn't doing any work at all, leaning back in his chair with the posture of a man who had always belonged in any room he entered, but with a stillness that was slightly too complete. The stillness of a man who had stopped his normal fidgeting because he was afraid of what his fidgeting might give away. When Caleb reached the name Walter Garman, Wall's fingers lay flat. When he reached Raymond Ose Cross, finally looked up, not at Caleb at the wall, just past his shoulder. When he finished, he closed the folder and set it on the table and looked across at the three of them. "I'm going to ask Dr. Cassidy to join us," he said. He nodded to the woman with the tablet who stepped into the hallway, and 30 seconds later, Cassidy walked in, pale younger looking than his actual age in the fluorescent light, wearing the expression of someone who had been waiting for this specific door to open and had not managed to make peace with the waiting. He sat down in the empty chair without being told to. Wall started to say something. Caleb raised one hand, not urgently, just with finality. "Dr. Cassidy is going to speak for himself," he said. "And while he does, I'd remind everyone in this room that we have a complete modification log with user IDs and timestamps, and that the difference between cooperating now and not cooperating now is a difference that everyone here will feel for a very long time." Cassidy looked at the folder. Then he started talking. He spoke for 9 minutes. He did not cry, and he did not try to justify anything he just described in sequential order. What had happened on the night of Raymond Ose's case, the conversation with Dorothy, the conversation with Wall, the decision that was framed to him as routine documentation management, the 2:47 a.m. login from his apartment, the 14 minutes, the 3 lines he deleted, and the 2 he replaced them with. He described the previous 2 cases he had been involved in lesser roles where similar adjustments had been made by other people, and he had been told to consider it standard risk management practice. He described the understanding he had been given implicitly and not once, but repeatedly, that the clinical documentation at this hospital was managed in service of the institution's liability exposure, and that this was simply how things worked, and that questioning it would cost him more than accepting it. He stopped. The room was very still. Wall turned toward Cassidy with the expression of a man about to say something that would be in some final tally the most counterproductive thing he could possibly say. "Finn. Dr. Wall," Caleb said without raising his voice in any way that would register on a recording. "You may not address the witness." Wall's mouth closed. It was a small thing in the scale of things. He had not been forcibly prevented from speaking. He had not been physically restrained or publicly humiliated or confronted with anything that required drama. He had simply been told no by a person in the room in a tone that contained no anger and no challenge and no uncertainty, and he had stopped. And in the stopping was something that everyone who had worked with him for years would have found difficult to imagine, not because the authority behind the instruction was unusual, but because the manner of it was quiet without performance, without any visible need to assert itself, the voice of someone for whom authority had never been something to display because it had never been something to doubt. Wall looked at the folder on the table. For the first time in the meeting, something moved through his face that was not composure or calculation, something older and less controlled, the beginning of an understanding that the thing he had been managing for years was not what he had believed it to be. The door opened. She came through the door the way she came through every door in this building, which was without announcement and without performance and without any adjustment of pace to the weight of the moment. And she was wearing the clothes she had worn to the grocery store that morning because she had not known specifically that today was the day, only that it was a day that was close, and she had the manila folder under her arm and the small silver pin was on her lapel where it had always been, and she walked to the table and sat down in the empty chair beside Caleb without looking at anyone else in the room first. Wall stared at her. He had the look of a man confronting an object that had failed to behave according to his understanding of what objects did, the specific disorientation of someone whose model of reality is encountering data that doesn't fit. And Dorothy was familiar with this look because she had been producing it in people for most of her professional life, and she found it no more remarkable now than she had the first 100 times. She placed the folder on the table. She did not open it. Caleb looked at the three people across the table. He had the ease of someone who had been doing the thing he was doing for long enough that the performance of it had become simply the doing of it. And when he spoke, his voice had the same quality it had had throughout the meeting, measured clear without heat, which was its own kind of heat. "I want to introduce Dorothy Reeves," he said, 28-year emergency room nurse at this facility, voluntary consultant to the DOJ Medical Integrity Program from 2009 to 2018. Author of the preliminary report that opened this investigation 6 months ago, and the primary documentation source for the modification log discrepancy that forms the core of our evidentiary case. He paused. "She also, for the record, keeps printed copies of every significant patient note she writes before her shift ends. She has done this for 14 months. Which is why her original notes on the Osei case exist in two forms, the version you attempted to delete Dr. Cassidy and the version she had already printed before you touched the file." Brixton was looking at Dorothy with the expression of a man running and rerunning a calculation and arriving at an answer he didn't want. Cross had gone the color of old paper. Wall had gone very still. She filed the preliminary report, Wall said slowly, and it was not a question, but it was not quite a statement either. It was the sound of a man arriving at an understanding in real time out loud involuntarily. 6 months ago, Caleb confirmed. "And you?" Wall looked at Caleb. Something was moving through his face that was compiling itself from several things at once. The timeline, the name, the fact that the Attorney General of the United States was sitting across from him in a hospital conference room on a Thursday morning without a jacket or a tie. And then it arrived assembled, and the look it produced was one that Wall would spend considerable time in the following months trying not to remember. She's my mother," Caleb said. "And you terminated her yesterday morning for the same reason you terminated 6 other clinical staff members over the past 5 years, because she wouldn't stop saying what she saw, and saying what she saw was inconvenient to the way you operate." The room was utterly still. Brixton made a small sound, not a word, not quite a breath, something between the two that indicated a person arriving at the edge of something they had not expected to reach. Cross had her hands flat on the table. They were not shaking, but they were flat in the specific way of hands that are being held still rather than naturally resting. Wall looked at Dorothy. She looked at him. She had been in that room in this hospital for 28 years, and she had looked at him across tables and bedsides and chart stations, and every time she had looked at him, she had known exactly what she was seeing, which was a man whose intelligence was real and whose skill was real, and who had allowed both of those things to be entirely in service of his own certainty about where he sat in any room he occupied, and the cost of that certainty had been paid by other people, by nurses who'd been told they were overstepping, and patients who'd been told they were fine, and families who'd been handed settlements and told to move on, and she had watched the cost accumulate for a long time, and she had waited, and she had kept her notes, and she had sent her report, and she had been ready, and she was here. "I told you," Dorothy said in the quiet, clear voice that she had always used in rooms like this one, "that you didn't understand what was coming." She paused for a single beat. "Now you do." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Caleb nodded to the woman with the tablet. The woman with the tablet opened the door and said 2 words to the people in the hallway. And the morning which had started, ordinarily, became something that Millhaven General would not forget for the rest of its institutional life. By noon, the parking lot of Millhaven General contained 3 additional vehicles that had not been there in the morning, and the IT suite on the basement level was occupied by 4 people in professional attire who were copying server contents with a thoroughness and speed that the hospital's own IT staff watched from the hallway, with the uncomfortable attention of people who are witnessing something they have not been briefed on and cannot stop. Walcross and Brixton were escorted from the conference room at 11:48, not in handcuffs, not yet. That came later and in different circumstances, but in the company of federal officers who communicated through their positioning and their demeanor that the distinction between voluntary accompaniment and its alternative was entirely up to the 3 people being accompanied, and that none of those 3 people appeared interested in testing it. Cassidy was not escorted anywhere. He sat in the conference room after the others left with a glass of water he had not touched, and the expression of a young man who had cooperated fully, which was the most he could say for himself, and which was going to count for something, and was not going to be sufficient to carry everything, and he appeared to know both of these things. The ER continued to run. This was not remarkable. Hospitals ran regardless of what was happening in their administrative corridors, but there was something quietly significant about the way the work continued, as the institution around it was being reorganized, as if the actual purpose of the place persisted, despite the failure of its management. Which was, Dorothy had always believed the truth about medicine. The work was more durable than the people who tried to own it. Tara was at the nurse's station when the escorting happened. She did not stop working, but she watched through the glass of the corridor as the 3 people who had built and maintained the thing that had been built and maintained here walked out of the building between federal officers, and she felt something that was not quite satisfaction and was not quite relief, but was somewhere in the vicinity of both the feeling of a story, reaching a point it was always going to reach, arriving on schedule. Opal Grant came to stand beside her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Opal said quietly, without looking away from the window, "How long did she know?" "I think she always knew," Tara said. "She was just waiting until it was solid enough that nobody could make it go away." Opal absorbed this. She had been a nurse for 23 years, and she had developed over those years a fairly comprehensive understanding of the ways that systems failed and the ways that individuals sometimes managed to survive those failures with their integrity intact. And she recognized in what she was watching through the glass something she had not expected to see in this particular building. "Good," Opal said. "One word." Then she went back to her work. Dorothy walked into the ICU waiting room at 12:37 in the afternoon, still in her own clothes, without a badge or a title or any marker of institutional role, and she sat down in the chair beside Ruth Osei, the same way she had sat beside her at Raymond's gurney 2 nights ago, without announcement, without preamble, simply present. Ruth looked at her for a moment with the careful recognition of someone who had been told a name and had been hoping to match it to a face. "You're," Dorothy Ruth said. "Yes." Ruth turned back to the window. Outside, the parking structure was its usual indifferent self-gray concrete and afternoon light, and the ICU monitor visible through the glass of Raymond's room was showing a rhythm that was slow but was there. Dorothy said, without hedging and without softening it beyond what was kind, "Your husband has a pulmonary embolism. It was there when he came in. I saw it and I said so, and I wasn't listened to. He coded because of the delay in treatment. He is alive because your heart was working for 2 hours longer than most people could have made it work, and because when it stopped, there was a team there to bring it back. But he is in that room because of a decision that was made that night that should have been made differently." Ruth's hands clasped in her lap did not move. She looked at Raymond through the glass. "I know," Ruth said. "I'm sorry I couldn't." "You didn't fail him," Ruth said. Her voice was steady in the way of someone who had been crying for 36 hours and had arrived somewhere beyond it. "You tried. You were the only one who tried." She paused. "What happened to the ones who didn't?" "They're being addressed." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "What does that mean for Raymond?" "It means the truth of what happened to him will be part of the record. It means it won't be buried. It means the people responsible will face consequences." Dorothy paused. "And it means that what happened to him will make it harder for the same thing to happen to someone else." Ruth looked at her. The afternoon light through the waiting room window was flat and practical, the kind that didn't beautify anything but showed everything clearly. That's something Ruth said. It's not everything Dorothy said, but it's something. Ruth looked down at her hands, then at Dorothy's lapel where the small silver pin was still in its place. "What is that?" she asked. Dorothy looked down at it. Then she looked at Ruth with the closest thing to a smile she had produced in several days. "Something that helped me find my way back when I needed to," she said. Ruth nodded slowly as if this were entirely adequate as an explanation. Perhaps at that moment it was. The emergency board meeting convened at 3 in the afternoon with 5 members present instead of 7 because 2 of the 7 were Harold Brixton, who was currently in a federal building answering questions, and a second member who had resigned by phone that morning with a brevity that suggested pre-prepared language. The 5 remaining members had the collective expression of people who had arrived at a meeting with no good options and were trying to determine which of the available bad ones was least bad. And Caleb Reeves stood at the front of the room without a presentation, without supporting materials, with only the specific quality of attention he brought to rooms where he needed things to be said plainly. The Department of Justice will be conducting an ongoing investigation into patient safety practices, documentation integrity, and administrative decisions at this facility for the foreseeable future, he said. In the interim, all clinical operations will continue under federal oversight guidance. No administrative personnel changes will be made without DOJ notification. All documentation modification requests will require dual authorization and a federal audit trail. One of the board members, a man in his 60s who had been on the board for 3 years, and who had the specific discomfort of someone who was implicated by association rather than by action, asked whether there was a path toward normal operations. "Normal operations are what we're trying to build," Caleb said. "What existed before was not normal. It was a situation in which clinical staff were routinely punished for doing their jobs, and patients were routinely misled about what had been done to them, and the institution's leadership treated this as acceptable because it was profitable. That's the thing that will not continue." The room was quiet. "What about Ms. Reeves?" another board member asked. "Dorothy Reeves. Is she?" "That is her decision," Caleb said. "And it's not mine to influence. He looked around the room at the 5 remaining faces. "What I'd suggest is that when you speak to her, you lead with what you're prepared to offer. That's actually worth her time, because she has options that she didn't have yesterday, and she knows it, and you'd be wise to proceed accordingly." He picked up the folder he had brought in the same folder, now considerably fuller, and walked toward the door. He turned at the threshold. "There are nurses in this building who flagged safety concerns and were disciplined for it," he said. "There are 6 who were terminated. I'd suggest that undoing those actions be the first thing on your agenda this week." He paused. "And the next time a nurse tells you that a patient is dying, you listen." He left. The boardroom was quiet for a long time after. 3 weeks after the arrests, after the federal investigation had been formally announced, after the charges against Wall, Cross, and Brixton had been filed, after the local and regional press had spent 10 days on a story that had briefly attracted national attention, and then given way to the next thing, as stories did, a meeting was held in the second-floor conference room at Millhaven General with 9 people present, and the subject of the meeting was what came next. Dorothy was not sitting at the head of the table. She was sitting in one of the middle seats, which was where she had always been most comfortable, and she had been asked to come to this meeting by the acting hospital administrator, a woman brought in by the board to handle the transition period, who had the air of someone who understood that the best thing she could do right now was listen to the people who had been here and learn what should have been built differently. What Dorothy had asked for was specific and independent nursing review board, entirely separate from the physician hierarchy, with the authority to flag any patient safety concern directly to administration and to a federal reporting pathway, without the concern going through the clinical attending, who may have been the source of it, and with explicit documented protection for the person raising it. The acting administrator had said yes before Dorothy finished the sentence. The board was constituted that week. It had 5 members initially. Tara Bloom was the youngest by 12 years. When the first meeting was called and Tara sat down at the table looking, Dorothy thought the way people looked when they understood the weight of something and were choosing to carry it anyway. Dorothy looked at her from across the room and felt something that she recognized after a moment as recognition. The look you give someone when you see them becoming the thing you were hoping they would become. "Ready?" Dorothy asked. Tara straightened her folder. "I have some questions about the escalation pathway." "Good," Dorothy said. "That's exactly the right thing to have." The meeting started. Outside the window, the November sky was doing the particular thing it did in this part of the country at this time of year, going pale and wide and still, and the parking lot below was just a parking lot, cars in rows, people coming and going, the ordinary business of a day at a place where people brought their worst moments and hoped with the particular desperation of the sick that someone would know what to do. Someone would. Dorothy had made sure of it. On a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the investigation began, when the ER was running the quiet early-hour rhythm of a department that had not yet been tested by the day Dorothy stood at the nurse's station and looked at something that had not been there before. The plaque was small, about the size of a piece of paper bronze on a dark wood background, and it had been placed at eye level on the wall beside the station where nurses reaching for charts would see it without looking for it. The wording had been chosen by Ruth Osei, who had donated it, who had worked with a local engraver over 2 weeks to find language that said what she wanted to say. It read, "In memory of those we lost, and in recognition of those who refuse to lose anyone without speaking first. Patient safety begins when someone believes that a voice matters more than a title." Below the text was a list of names. Raymond Osei's name was first marked with a small notation "survived" because someone listened. Dorothy stood in front of it for a long time. She thought about the other names on the list, the ones without that notation, the ones whose families had eventually learned the truth and had met with federal prosecutors and had filed civil actions that would move through the courts for years. And she thought about the weight of those names, which was not the weight of defeat, because they had been silenced for years and were silenced no longer, but was the weight of what it cost to get here, which was a cost that had not been paid by her alone. Tara appeared at her shoulder. She hadn't heard Tara come over. She didn't turn. After a moment, she unclipped the silver pin from her lapel, the oak tree with roots and branches in equal measure, and held it out. Tara took it and looked at it, turning it in the light. "I don't know what it means," Tara said. "It means that what holds you up and what you put into the ground are the same thing Dorothy said. It means you belong to the work." Tara held it for a moment. Then she clipped it to her own lapel. Neither of them said anything else for a while. She was at the kitchen table when the call came in the early evening, with the last of the daylight making its slow retreat through the window above the plant, and the coffee she had poured 40 minutes earlier was still warm, which was different from the last time she had sat at this table with coffee at this hour, when it had been cold, and the morning had not yet started, and the day ahead had been unknown. The phone showed Caleb's number. "You eat dinner yet?" he asked. "I was thinking about it. Thinking about it means no. It means I'm considering my options." He laughed, which was a sound she heard less often than she would have liked, not because he didn't laugh, but because his calls usually had an agenda, and agendas didn't leave much room for it. "Mom," he said after a moment. Are you all right?" Actually, she looked at the table. The legal pad was gone, put away in a drawer where it belonged. Now that its purpose was complete, and the table was just a table again, with a coffee mug and a plant on the windowsill and the ordinary objects of a Tuesday evening. "I think so," she said. "I think, for the first time in a long time, I don't feel tired in the way I've been feeling tired." A brief silence on the line, the kind that held something in it. "Thank you, Mom," he said, "for not staying quiet." "Thank you for listening," she said when I finally wasn't. On a Wednesday morning 2 months after the arrests and 4 days after the new Independent Review Board had logged its first formal patient safety flag, which had been reviewed within 15 minutes and had resulted in an immediate cardiology consult for a 58-year-old man with chest pain who turned out, in fact, to have the pulmonary embolism that the nursing staff had suspected Dorothy stood at the entrance to the ER. It was 7 in the morning. The shift was changing. Through the automatic doors, she could see the nurses gathering at the station with their clipboards and their coffee, hear the monitors registering their steady consensus of the living watch. The resident at the far end of the bay leaned toward a nurse to ask something. Listen, rather than dictate, which was a thing she had seen more often recently, and which she took no credit for, and considered the best possible news. Tara came through the interior door with 2 cups of coffee, saw Dorothy standing at the entrance, and walked over. She was wearing the silver pin on her left lapel. "Ready," Tara said, and handed her a cup. Dorothy took it. The coffee was hot and black and exactly right. She looked at the ER, at the people in it, and the work they were doing, and the fact that every single one of the nurses moving through the space right now knew with the certainty that only comes from it having been proven that if they saw something and said something, the saying would count. And she felt, in the particular quiet of 7 in the morning before the day had decided what it was going to be. Something that she had been working toward for a long time, and that felt now that she was standing in it exactly like what it was. She walked in. The doors closed behind her and the work continued. And nothing that had happened in those rooms over the past 6 years would ever be forgotten, not by the people who had been there, not by the families who had waited in those chairs, not by the institution that had finally at cost been made to become what it was always supposed to be. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone who refused to stay quiet, or someone who finally found their voice, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Stories like Dorothy's are happening every day in hospitals and schools and workplaces across this country, and they matter. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next one. Like this video if you believe that one voice at the right moment can change everything, because it can. It already has.